Hello everybody, my name is Hassan Nafid. I am an anatomy and physiology instructor at Madison College in Wisconsin. We will continue talking about the skeletal system. This time we will talk about the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is this group of bones that are attached to the trunk. They form basically the bones of the upper limbs and the lower limbs. The bones of the upper limb and the lower limbs play a big role in mobility and hands movements and actions that we do. We use the bones and the muscles of the hand to grab, to write, to do things, and the bones of the lower limb helps us to move from spot, to walk, to run, to do a lot of movements. I am going to take one example to talk about the anatomy of the lower limbs or the anatomy of the appendicular skeleton. We are going to take the femur as an example. The femur is the strongest bone in the body. It is the longest bone in the body, and I will use it to demonstrate the anatomy of the upper or the lower limb and the long bones anatomy. If you take a look at the femur here, the femur has two ends. A distal end, this is the femur in a standing position. This is the proximal end and the distal end. The proximal end is called the proximal epiphysis, and the distal end is known as the distal epiphysis. In between we have the shaft, and this is known as the diaphysis. So the long bone has a proximal epiphysis, a distal epiphysis, and a diaphysis or the shaft. The femur has a head and has a neck, and connected right underneath it we have the lesser trochanter and we have the greater trochanter. So a head, a neck, and the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter. This part is known as the linea aspera, and the lower end of the femur, which is known as the distal epiphysis, has two sides, as you can tell. This is helpful to determine which part of the femur is the front or the anterior and which part is the back or the posterior. If you could see here, the lower part here, there is two big projections. We call them condyles and epicondyles. In between there is a depression or a groove. We call it intercondylar fossa. The intercondylar fossa always points to the back of the femur, so that tells me this is the posterior side of the femur, while this part, which is the front part, has a shallow area, and this is a patellar surface. This points to the anterior part of the femur. So basically you are looking at the left femur because the head has to point medially to fit into the acetabulum. If we take a look at the anatomy or the inner anatomy of the femur, and that is looking at a femur that is open, we can identify two main regions in the femur as an example of a long bone: a compact bone and the medullary bone. The long bones, including the femur, usually is lined up by a tough sheet. This sheet covers and enclose the outer surface of the bone and is known as a periosteum. After the periosteum, if I showed you this model here, you are going to see the compact bone. Let's make it a little magnified here for you. Here is our medullary bone, the yellow marrow, and we have the compact bone. These are arteries that nourish the femur, and as you see here, this white structure, this is a cartilage. It's the articular cartilage which always cover the ending or the epiphysis of long bones to cushion the joint, to cover the surface of the joint or the bone that articulate with another bone, to prevent friction and to ease mobility. Over time, unfortunately, this might be eroded or get thinner and produce a lot of pain and difficulty in mobility, a condition known as osteoarthritis. If you take a look at this part here, or the epiphysis of the head of the femur here, you could identify another type of bone. This is the spongy bone, and the spongy bone is a little thinner, got some marrow to it, and actually the spongy bones are found at the endings of long bones, and you find it in flat bones too. And these are sites of erythropoiesis, or manufacturing of blood cells. The three types of blood cells: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Also, if you take a closer look here, this line is known as the epiphyseal line, and this is the line which mark the closure of the growth line in the long bones. We know bones growth in width and in length by ossification, where you find the ossification centers, or these are the centers where the bone expand in lengths in the two directions, and this is the way we grow. These epiphyseal lines usually close at puberty in girls and boys, a little later in boys than the girls. And when we stop growing, this is the time they close, and no more growth in legs of the bone will take place. So, to summarize, a long bone like the femur would have two ends. A proximal end, we call it proximal epiphysis, and a distal end, we call it distal epiphysis, and a shaft that we call the diaphysis. And we have sometimes a head, sometimes we have condyles and epicondyles, like medial epicondyle and lateral epicondyle. And as we said, it's important to determine which side is front and which side is back, and that way you would know which side is medial, which side is lateral. I will see you next time in another session of our anatomy. Next time probably going to talk about the joints. Thank you for watching this video, and wish you luck until I see you next time. Thank you.